Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon if you are on the East Coast. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to give folks a few minutes to join. While folks are joining, invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from.
Mike, you're in Seattle right now?
Well, I'm from Seattle,
Oh, okay.
but
I was like, you're in Seattle.
uh,
You tell me.
great energy here. DC, Georgia, South Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, some folks from California, bright and early. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you first to Clinicians of Color, Kim and Lisa, for inviting us back. Really love these presentations with this community. Today, we're going to be talking about all things hiring for therapy practice owners. We get a lot of questions at Herd around hiring. Should I hire independent contractors? Should I hire W-2 employees? How does this whole process work? So if you are a solo therapist in private practice and you're thinking about expanding to a group practice, you're at the right place. And if you are a group practice owner and you're just looking to, brush up, we're glad that you're here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into our presentation. We have 69 folks here on the call, so quite a large group. I think we had over 280 therapists register. We should see that number continue to go up as folks trickle in here. If you do have questions, please drop them in the Q&A. You'll see it at the bottom of the Zoom screen. There's a spot. It looks like a chat bubble, and that allows us just to track your questions easier than dropping them in the chat. But also, please do use the chat. We love to hear from the audience. Makes it a lot more fun. And yes, this is being recorded. People will ask if you do need to jump off early. Excuse me. If you have a client session at 1, don't worry. We'll send you the recording. We can also link to the slides as well. So don't feel like you need to take notes. So just sit back, listen, and feel free to engage as we go through. We will save time at the end for questions. We'll also stop during the presentation as well and take questions after each slide. Warm-up question here. Do you currently have employees for your therapy practice? Drop a 1 in the chat if yes, 2 if no. Great. Mostly 2s, but some 1s as well. So it looks like a good mix here of group practice owners and solo practice owners. So just before we dive in, quick overview on Herd. So Herd is the financial back office for therapists in private practice. We're all about empowering therapists like you as entrepreneurs and business owners. We have a all-in-one financial software that helps you to manage your bookkeeping, your taxes, your payroll, which is very important when it comes to hiring employees. We'll talk about that. And we also provide access to experts who really specialize in working with therapists, which allows you to do the work that you love, which is focus on your clients and not managing your finances. We work with therapists throughout the life cycle of their business, from new therapy practice owners to therapists who are more established, and folks who are like yourself, who are looking to expand their business as well. We do have a special offer that I wanted to mention here right at the top, specifically for Clinicians of Color. If you're interested in joining Herd, we are offering 50% off for your first 2 months if you sign up using code COC at check out. We also offer free consultations. So if you just want to learn more about Herd and how it works, you can scan this QR code. We'll send this out as well. Spots are limited for free consults and they do book up. So if you're interested in scheduling a call, would recommend you jumping on that. And with that, I will introduce our co-founder and CEO, Andrew Riesen.
Hello. Happy Friday to everybody. A very happy Friday. To the morning folks, thank you for being here and getting up and coming to listen to someone talk about how to hire employees and grow a group practice. For the afternoon folks, less proud of you, but still proud of you that you're here. I am a lifelong accountant that has been trying to escape accounting, but it always keeps bringing me back. I worked for a wealth manager that worked largely with independent physicians and group practices in Portland, Oregon. I worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers and I worked with small to medium sized businesses on the financial accounting side and the tax side as well. And then I built a tax software startup prior to starting Herd with my amazing co-founder, Victoria. I also happen to be married to a clinical psychologist and by process of a never-ending PhD program. Many of my best friends are also clinical psychologists, some of whom have started group practices. I am a mental health advocate. I deal with anxiety and certainly panic disorder as well, so I love doing presentations. And I'm just very grateful for the work that you all do, and I feel really, really grateful that the work that I've been able to do has intersected in this field as well. And so what do I know about hiring and growing practices? I've hired 75 employees and contractors over the past 4 years. I've helped hundreds of independent practitioners set up group practices. I do want to caveat, however, I am not a lawyer. The advice that I am providing you is not legal advice. It's through experience. And so my recommendation would always be to validate that information with a legal professional before you make a legal decision as well. So did want to caveat that as well before we jumped in. But let's do it. Let's have fun.
Legal team loves to hear that. We're going to jump ahead.
Correct.
Great. Here's our agenda.
Awesome. So we'll talk through, why you should think about hiring. And also, I want to caveat this presentation is not you should absolutely hire people if you're at a place where you have a full caseload. This is an opportunity to explore what it could potentially look like, talk about some of the nuances, talk about what it means to actually hire somebody and onboard somebody. And so don't feel pressure coming out of this conversation of like, oh, I'm not where I should be, or I should be growing into a group practice. Where you are is perfectly fine, and the timeline of which you are approaching things is completely perfect the way that you are. Only you know what is best for you. We'll talk through when to hire. We'll talk through who to hire, whether it's a contractor or a W-2. We'll talk about how much to pay. And I know we have some group practices on here as well. And so throughout this conversation as well, I would love the feedback from you all as to how you have approached it, because everybody sets up group practices differently and states have different levels of requirement. And so I'm really excited for this conversation, and especially that we have a diverse base of stages of the life cycle as well. And then we'll talk through how to stay compliant, because I love compliance as a nerdy accountant. Awesome. So what are some considerations as to why you might hire? And so hiring and growing your solo practice into a group practice is a massive step. There are big questions like who will help, who will your practice help? So maybe you have a specific niche that you've built into. My wife is a DBT focused therapist, and she has ambitions of setting up and growing a group practice eventually. And there's nuances and some more legal requirements when she's doing DBT and clinical work. And so you have to take the types of things into consideration as well. What kind of therapist do you want working for you? Do you want pre-licensed professionals? Do you want interns? Do you want experienced professionals? This all holds weight in how you think about legally structuring employment agreements and the type of employee that somebody might be. Do you want to hire and supervise interns, knowing that there might be additional work that you have to take on outside of the scope of just the clinical work as well, and supporting them as clinicians? What will your impact be on the local community? Do you want to be an insurance-based practice? Do you want to be a cash pay-based practice? Do you want to, lean heavier in a fee split for the clinicians, or are you hoping to take a little bit more? both strategies are totally fine and they're totally right and totally up to you. What do you want your role to be? Do I want to be the one that's focused on supervising and managing the clinical operations of the practice and being the CFO of the practice? I know personally, as I've grown in my role at this company, my role has changed quite a bit. And initially, it was managing all of the company operations on a day-to-day basis, and managing the finance, and managing the admin, and managing the payroll, and managing how we acquire clients. And then we brought in amazing people like Michael to help, and brought in a COO to help run the day-to-day operations. And so get a sense of what you want your role to be. And a good way to think about that is, thinking through your strengths and your weaknesses, and spending more time probably thinking about your strengths and where you might be able to lean in a little bit more there as well. And also, ultimately, what's the end goal for your practice? So it is probably harder to have a transition plan for a solo practice, but in a group practice on a very regular basis, one of the things that I see is people are able to sell the practice and the clinical operations that have been set up, and the team and the space. And so think about, what is the end goal for your practice and what are you looking to build towards? Is it longevity? Is it a transition plan? Is it a small practice that you want to keep? And so there's lots of questions that you should be asking yourselves as you're approaching this. I'm curious, for the group practice, the folks that are already in group practice, what are some of the questions that were important to you prior to jumping into group practice as well? Or what were some of those scary things that you were thinking about as you were jumping in there?
I'll add here that I've interviewed a few group practice owners now on Herd Business School, which is our new podcast. And Elizabeth Earnshaw shared with me that, as a group practice owner, she thought like the biggest challenge was going to be hiring therapists. It was going to be marketing, because now you have to like get more clients for your group, but it really is people management, right? Because once you hire other therapists, now you're a manager and you're a supervisor, and you have to have tough conversations with people. And she didn't really think about that before hiring. And that's not to deter you from doing that, but I think it's important to set that expectation that your role does change when you grow from us, being a solo therapist in private practice where it's just you, to now you're the owner of a group practice. And Nicole said being able to afford payroll for sure. So if if you have employees, which we'll talk about, W-2 employees, payroll needs to clear. People need to get paid, whether it's every 2 weeks or every month. And another story Elizabeth Earnshaw shared with me was that when there wasn't enough money in the bank to cover payroll, she drove around to people's houses and dropped off cash, because it was important for her that like her people got paid. Great.
So when to hire? Um, there's no perfect moment to hire another therapist for your practice, but certainly a place or a moment in time that you can start thinking about that is when your caseload is full and you've started to build a strong wait list. And so maybe you've built a big referral network. Maybe you've built relationships with physicians, and other folks in your local community that are driving back a number of clients to you. And your goal is to continue supporting clients in your area. But the risk of hiring too early is that you may struggle to fill the caseload. And even, I want to acknowledge as well, you may struggle to fill the caseload even after you have a full practice and a wait list. And there's going to be ebbs and flows in the practice. And that puts a lot of pressure on you as a business owner. So make sure that you have a clear goal, or a clear focus as to why you want to move into independent practice. And also that you feel like you're at a good place from a caseload standpoint. Again, whether it's insurance based or cash pay, and you have a clear understanding of how you're going to be able to acquire those clients to support the clinician as well. And also whether or not you want to bring on a full-time or just a part-time clinician as well. And we'll talk through what that can look like from a legal standpoint.
Another pop quiz. Do you know the difference between a W-2 employee and 1099 contractor? This is a safe space, so you can be honest. If you're not sure, maybe you think you know, you can drop a 3 or maybe a 1.5. All right, getting a lot of ones. That's good. We got a 1.5. Someone's being honest. Great. Well, we're going to talk about it.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm sure the group practice folks on this call have gone through this process of really identifying what's best based on the state regulations. Okay, so an independent contractor, they work on a freelance basis, and so you've probably heard a 1099, an independent contractor, but a self-employed individual. Again, an independent contractor is somebody that works on a freelance basis. Each contractor owns their own separate business. This can be a sole proprietorship, or they can have a formal LLC or a PLLC. This means that they are responsible individually for reporting their income to the IRS and paying taxes against their income to the IRS, which means that they would have to be estimating their taxes on their own and paying their taxes on their own. Typically, the way that this is set up is a contractor is going to send you an invoice for the work that's completed and you'll pay. But there's also probably a number of folks on this call that run group practices that, pay their independent contractors through Gusto or QuickBooks or other platforms that have great time tracking solutions. And maybe you do time tracking through your EHR and keep track of sessions through the EHR and pay out that way. And so everybody approaches it differently. But again, an independent contractor, they're responsible for paying taxes. You are not responsible for paying taxes for them. Employees, they're going to work for you on an ongoing basis. You're going to withhold income tax, FICA, FUTA, Social Security, Medicare, all of that good stuff, which falls into the FICA and FUTA taxes. And typically, it's also up to you to track the work done by this employee and issue the paychecks on a regular basis. And so you'll have a payroll system that you have set up. You'll have payroll tax returns that you're responsible for, and you'll be paying those wages. And you can typically assume if you have payroll taxes, there's probably an additional 20 to 25% from a cost overhead standpoint on every single employee that you're going to bring in. Employment or employees are also challenging in a group practice setting for clinicians as well, because if you're paying them a consistent salary and you're on insurance contracts that have a leg in how they pay, you can get into a sticky situation to where you might not have enough cash in the bank to actually pay your employees till it's paid out. And so thinking about your operational procedures and your strategies of how somebody's going to get paid and when they're going to get paid is really important, whether they're an independent contractor or an employee.
This is really helpful, and I think this is going to tee us up for where we're going next. But my understanding here, when folks ask like, well, should we hire an independent contractor? Should we hire an employee? It's not always like up to you to decide if it's a contractor or employee. You have to follow the rules of the law, and every state has different laws. And we're going to talk about a few tests that exist to determine whether someone should be classified legally as a contractor or an employee.
All right, we're going to get into some nerdy stuff here. The common law test. And so the common law test presumes that a worker is an independent contractor unless specific standards are met. There are three factors: behavioral control, financial control, and then the type of the relationship, nature of the relationship as well. The IRS uses this test for employment tax purposes, and there's 18 states as well, including the District of Columbia, that uses it as a law. For the folks in California, one thing to note is that across the board, whether it's a entity law or employment law, they have pretty strict standards around that. New York as well being a great example of that. So we will talk through what are these different conditions. We have a couple of amazing flow charts that Mike put together, one of his specialties. So I'm excited to dive in and talk through a couple of those things. And please ask any questions along the way that might be helpful to answer for folks. And also please share tips along the way as to what you've learned in the process.
Thanks. Maybe I spent too much time on these graphs, but hope they're helpful.
We'll find out. We can get
All right.
feedback after.
Yeah.
So does the company have control or have the right to control what the worker does and how the worker does his or her or their job? If yes, then this person is probably an employee. If no, this person might be a contractor. I know when you read this as well, you're like, gosh, if I hire a clinician to come into my practice to do repeated clinical work, and I'm the one that is supplying that work to them, that feels an awful lot like an employee. And I'm shaking my head because it is an awful lot like an employee. But there was another question that came through here as well from Jasani. Jasani, did I say that right? Did I pronounce that correctly? Um, and so for a social media manager or a digital marketer, or let's say you brought in somebody to redesign your website, that is a very like project-based job. That is not a repetitive task to where you have the right to control what is, what this person is doing on the day-to-day basis, right? You have set up a project, you have set up a contract. Hey, starting on July 26th until August 15th, that is when you are going to do this website work. This is what the outcome is going to be. But then you have a clinician that you bring in and you said, hey, we're going to work to a caseload of 10 to 12 clients. I'm going to supply the clients. This is our operational procedures. This is how you're going to show up. Um, this is the way that we communicate with our clients. So it becomes a little bit more black and white, I would say, around clinical work as well. With that being said, some folks still do choose to take the contractor path in states where things are a little bit more ambiguous and unclear. Are the business aspects of the worker's job controlled by the employer? Again, if yes, they are an employee. If no, they are a contractor. One thing that I do want to caveat as well is many clinicians are deeply entrepreneurial, right? And so clinicians will do adjunct work. They'll set up a content program. They'll have they'll be doing supervision work. Maybe they're selling courses and then they're also doing clinical work, or maybe they're working at a group practice and then they have a cash pay practice and then they're working with a Headway or a Lyra. And in that case, you probably could make the argument where if somebody is controlling their schedule and owning their schedule fully, and maybe they're just doing 4 to 5 clients with you on top of the many other things that they're doing, is you don't actually control this worker's job and they have more flexibility in that and decision making. But if you are the producer of the majority of an individual's income and they're repeatedly doing the same work again and again, in all likelihood, that's probably an employee. But again, if it's an individual that's doing lots of different type of work, or they receive income from a number of different sources, you'd probably be able to state that this individual is a contractor. Ultimately, go ahead to the next one, Mike. But ultimately, what it comes down to is defense, right? And support of the decision that you've made. And if you ever get into the situation, God forbid that you would, to where there's an employment disagreement, or you have to let an employee go, and then the employee goes to the state board or to an employment lawyer and comes back to you and says, oh, well, I actually should have been an employee, and because of that I should have received benefits for X, Y, and Z reason. It can just be a risk. And so doing the legwork on the front end to figure this out so you don't get bitten on the back end is very important. Are there written contracts or employee type benefits? If yes, that's probably employee. If no, that's probably a contractor. Any questions here, or for the folks that set up group practices, any experiences that you had going through this decision tree as you were setting up your group practice as well? I love the insights that we're getting from the folks out there. And thanks for everybody that's also participating and jumping in here.
Looks like no questions right now, which tells me this is very clear. So everyone understands perfectly, right, the difference between an employee and a contractor. Now we'll talk about the ABC test, which, just to be confusing, is a different way to think about employee versus contractors that other states use.
I also saw a question from Natasha, a great name, my partner's name. Gusto actually has a very, very exceptional calculator that helps you determine the cost of state taxes and federal taxes per employee. And you can do it on an hourly basis. You can do it on a salary basis. And so we can send that Gusto calculator after the fact. But personally, I always use that when I'm thinking about hiring an employee in a new state. The ABC test. So this presumes that a worker is an employee unless qualifications show otherwise. And so similar to what I was alluding to, in most cases, you probably assume that the work that this person is performing is the work of an employee. It considers three factors: the absence of control, the business of the worker, and the customary engagement. Again, customary engagement, I had alluded to the great question that I'd been asked around like a social media manager, right? Of something that's more project based versus contractual and repetitive and on an ongoing basis. And the Department of Labor uses this test for labor law purposes. And again, 33 states also use this as well. There will be a quiz on all of these tests at the end of the presentation. No, I'm just joking. That's triggering. Actually, the other night I had a dream that I like forgot to study for a test, and it was a big nightmare. And then I recognized that I'm an adult human that's no longer in school. Is the worker free from direct oversight and decides how and when they work? An example of somebody deciding how and when they work within a clinical practice. One of the things that I've seen is, let's say Michael is the group practice owner, but Michael's goal is to put together kind of just like a collective more than anything, right? And so Mike's got the space. He had a big office. Maybe he had, folks in the office before, and he's like, I don't really want to manage, but like I'm going to cover like the shared services in this space. I'm going to cover the office space. But like you can come here, you can do your thing, you can be under our group NPI, but you'll also be mainly responsible for getting clients yourself. You can determine what your caseload is. In that case, you probably make the argument that this individual is a contractor. But if Mike is like, this is my group practice, again, I'm covering all the shared services, I'm covering the office space that you're working in, I'm providing you supervision, you're under my group NPI, you're operating under these operational procedures, I am performance managing you and providing you feedback, then in that case, you're probably Mike's employee. And again, I don't know if you want to be Mike's employee. That might be a tough situation. But get an understanding of what that nature of that relationship is. Again, if it's a looser relationship and it's therapists that are coming together to operate out of a singular space but kind of operate independently, I'm thinking of a collective in Seattle specifically that operates in that way. Everybody would be operating on their own and they would all be independent contractors or 1099s, or in another word, self-employed. Does the worker perform tasks that are unusual for your business? I'm trying to think of something that would be unusual for therapy practice. Steam cleaning the carpets is probably not a regular occurrence. One of my jobs in college, very gross job. Steam cleaning the carpets is probably not a regular occurrence and might be considered unusual. Washing and cleaning the windows in the office, migrating or setting up a new like technology system in your practice, getting support to do that. Running digital marketing or, working with an agency, probably a contractor. Seeing clients, taking screening calls, doing intakes, doing session notes. A lot of that probably falls a little bit more in the employee camp. Is the worker available to be hired by other clients? And so this goes back to what I had alluded to before. And so is this individual somebody that is like Mike, for example? Mike works at Herd. He's a W-2 employee at Herd, but he also runs a newsletter. He does advising for other companies, and gosh knows how he gets the time to do all of the many things that he does. And so if Mike wasn't a full-time employee that was, doing project work for Herd, he would probably consider himself a contractor, right? But because Mike receives performance reviews from us, because I manage Mike, because he's, contributing member of the company outside of just the course of the marketing work that he does at the organization, Mike's an employee. But if Mike came in and I was like, hey, Mike, can you help build our content strategy? He actually started as a contractor for Herd, helped build our content strategy. And then somebody from our team will implement it. then he's probably a contractor. But given the nature of the work that he provides, that he is an employee for our practice. And so if you're an adjunct professor on a part-time basis and you are running a cash pay practice, but you just want to, maybe your friend opened a group practice and you want to help them pick up 4 to 5 clients a week, you're probably a contractor for your friend's group practice.
Is this different than a non-compete?
Um, yes. So a non-compete would be a part of the like quote unquote legally enforceable commitment that you sign in an employment contract when you're getting set up to work with an individual. If you're a contractor, you would be very hard pressed to enforce a non-compete. But if you hire somebody as an employee, oftentimes in employment agreements, people will put non-competes in. How enforceable they actually are, and there's actually been federal legislation that's, come to be more recently that they really aren't that enforceable, but it still kind of exists at the state level. A non-compete again would be a part of the actual employment contract when somebody's getting set up and getting started.
That
That's a
makes
great
sense.
question.
That's helpful.
Great. One thing that I wanted to call out specifically, therapist interns. So therapist interns, pre-licensed professionals. Nicole, I don't want to specifically opine on this. There is federal legislation that's been passed more recently that really kind of pushes everything back to the individual state. And so I would talk to the state employment board to understand how enforceable they are. But still, again, a lot of people will still use them in your employment agreements, and they're a very classic thing to include in an employment agreement. I know, as an example, in my wife's internship, one of the like values that they had as a company, because they came from places that had non-competes within like a 5 mile radius. One of the values they had is like, no way like would we ever hold a non-compete against you. Like, we want you to be able to see the clients that you've worked with throughout your time, working with us. And so ultimately a values decision. Level of enforceability is different on a state by state basis. So definitely talk to the state employment board about that. Great question. Therapist interns, so associates, pre-licensed professionals. It's different on a license by license basis. Therapist interns are generally considered employees rather than independent contractors due to the nature of their work and also the level of supervision and control exercised by their employer. This comes down to employment classification, state regulations. You're holding this person under your license. You're responsible for supervising this individual. You're covering their insurance liability. There's so much that you're having to do to support this individual to get them set up that it would be very hard to argue that this person is not a W-2 employee in your practice.
I think the answer to this question is yes, but do you know if this would apply to students as well? You think about like a grad student.
Um, yes. There's like a I was actually doing a lot of reading on this the other week, but yes, 100% would apply to grad students as well. Yeah, if you're holding somebody under your license, I mean that's as a starting point. Most states are just going to require you to have them as a W-2 employee, just
Yeah.
from a legal and a risk standpoint.
Yeah, and for folks who joined late, every state has different laws. And so always recommend checking with your state, checking with the legal professional. These really are kind of like best practices and general information, but definitely check at your state for confirmation.
What
And
does
great transition.
yeah, what does my state require? Mike, my slip in before you edited it. Lawyers are freaking expensive. My philosophy on lawyers is that they are very helpful. Many of my friends are lawyers. Many of them don't want to be lawyers anymore, but many of them are lawyers. But they're very expensive and the cost can add up really, really quickly. And so when it comes to setting up a new business entity or employment law, which is what we're talking about today, please take the following steps before you set up a conversation with a lawyer. It will also inform the conversation that you have with the lawyer and probably make you feel more confident in that conversation. Because I know personally, when I go to have a conversation with our employment lawyer or one of our, corporate lawyers, I feel so out of my depth, and I just like sometimes feel like really silly or stupid. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like I have no idea what I'm talking about. I just like I'm hoping to like understand. And so one of the things that I've gotten used to doing is like I'll go to my other friends that are founders. I'll go to, other friends that are business owners that have gone through a certain situation. And so my recommendation to you is talk to your therapist communities and networks. You know, hey, Michael in, Providence, Rhode Island, how did you approach hiring folks in your group practice? What were the things that you thought about? And then I would go to your state licensure board. And oftentimes, not always, they have a GC or a lawyer on hand that can help you think through these things. Will they help you? That's another story. But oftentimes they will. And oftentimes they'll have a lot of fantastic written material as well. I always point to Canft in California. I think they have some of the absolute bona fide best documentation for almost any sort of circumstance that exists that a marriage and family therapist might, undertake. How to think about setting up a business entity, the naming conventions for setting it up, the considerations, who the board is that you should, have that conversation with. And then again, for the employment employment law stuff, most of your licensure boards will have somebody that you can talk to about that. And then last, I would go to the state employment department and tell them about your plans and get some feedback from the state employment department as well. They might not be able to opine on a lot of stuff, and they might be like, we're not legal professionals. We can't help you with that. But be as specific as you possibly can. This is the type of therapist I am. This is the licensure that I am under. This is my licensure board and who I'm responsible for reporting to at a state level. This is what my goal is. I'm looking to hire 5 folks. One of them's an operations manager, one of them's a social media manager, 3 of them are clinicians. And so have that information in advance and then have those conversations. And this is a good kind of sequential order to go through in socializing and getting a good understanding.
To build on recommendation 1, I would also seek out either peer kind of consultation or supervision groups with other group practice owners as well. A lot of group practice owners I know are in groups and they meet with other group practice owners once a month and just kind of talk about their business, and that is really helpful for them. I would say Clinicians of Color, great Facebook group, ton of great information. There's also a lot of like bad information that's out there being shared in Facebook groups and communities. So just like take what you see, on social media and the advice that you see with, a grain of salt as well. I think the best thing to do here is like really just be kind of in community with other group practice owners. I will say Lisa Savage from Clinicians of Color, excellent group practice owner. For sure, seek her out if you need help or consultation.
And then it's easy getting everything set up, right? There's no steps. Once you decide that you want to hire a person, there's no other work that you have to do. So we talked through in basically the last 10 slides, employee classification, W-2 or contractor, right? But there's a lot of other stuff that comes into play when you're thinking about hiring a person, when you're thinking about onboarding a person, when you're thinking about setting them up for success. That in and of itself could be an entire presentation. It's something that I personally spend a lot of time thinking about, especially on the onboarding side, because the way that you set somebody up for success and orient somebody into the business and build their kind of 30 to 60, 90-day plan is the way that they're going to reflect on the business and integrate into the business over time as well. 100% set up an employment contract, whether it is a contractor agreement or whether it is an employment agreement for a W-2 employee. Please set up an employment contract. If something were to happen, God forbid, you want to have this employment contract in place, whether it's a contractor agreement, excuse me, or whether it's an employment agreement, things like duties, hours, compensation, termination policies, if things aren't working out, will they have equity in your business? There are so many things, non-competes. There are so many things that you want to layer into an employment contract to set yourself up for success legally. So tomorrow you does not face issues that today you forgot to think about. The employee I-9. So is this employee able to work in the United States? Are they able to work in the state that we are operating in. Liability insurance coverage. Are you going to require your folks to, get their own liability insurance? That's probably the case if they're a contractor. But if you're under a group NPI, it's probably you covering the liability insurance for all of these folks. And so talking to the CPH or trust to understand what you need to do, or whoever you might be getting that coverage through. Group NPI. Have you set up a group NPI? Have you figured out how to get these these new folks set up under your group NPI so you can bring in new insurance-based clients to them? Clear policies and procedures. So setting up an employee handbook. This is a very, very important thing. And so we have an employee handbook about the policies, procedures, and rules of operations that every employee at Herd has to sign and commit to. And so if this is a full-time employee, certainly set up those clear policies and procedures. It's going to be very helpful and is really an extension of that employment contract as well, and much more operational than legal. Orientation and employee training. One of the things that people often don't think about when they bring on a new employee is that this person might be learning, simple practice or Jane app for the first time. This person might be using new intake software. This person might need HIPAA training. This person might need supervision, and there may need to be a strategy as to when that's going to take place. And there's so much orientation and employee training that needs to take place. And so when you're thinking about that process of hiring and onboarding folks, take that into consideration of how much time that's going to take for you as well as you're thinking about balancing a caseload and setting up these new folks and setting them up for success. And so it can really be a lot. Again, supervision and support, building the strategy there. Are folks going to pay for supervision? Are you going to cover that supervision? How frequently are you going to provide supervision? Is it group soup? Is it individual supervision? Performance management. Performance management is critical. Documentation is critical. If you have an employee that is underperforming, in some states, you have to have very, very clear documentation of the repeated conversations that you've had in order to let them go. In other states, it's a little bit more flexible, to where it might be at will. And so performance management is very, very important. What I always recommend folks or friends that are setting up new businesses is just have a kind of a rolling one-on-one document and make sure that that employee can see it, make sure that you can see it, and that when there is feedback shared, that it's explicit, that it's written down, that the individual agrees to it and recognizes that they've also reviewed and seen it as well. And so some of this is getting into the nitty gritty of actually onboarding and getting employees set up, but all of this stuff is very important. And I would love to hear if there's anything else from the group practice owners that we're not thinking about as well.
Question from Angela. For the employee I-9, is that just employees or does that apply to contractors as well?
That's just employees, I believe, but I want to confirm on that.
Yeah, that's my understanding also. Question from Tendra. If I have a 1099 contractor, am I able to suggest the type of note style in the contract? Does that fall into like the way that they work?
Yeah, so if you're setting up a business, you are certainly more than responsible, or it's completely within your onus to be able to structure how that employee is going to work with you, and certainly build that into the contract, whether it's a contractor agreement or an employment agreement, and build it into the policies and procedures as well.
Great.
Great question, Tundra. I love that.
Question for the group here. You may have heard, or it may have been your experience if you've worked in a group practice, that group practice owners pay on a fee split. Do you think most group practice owners follow this process? Drop a 1 if you think yes, 2 if no. Great, mostly 1s, a few 2s. Seems like probably people's personal experience is probably with a fee split, would be my interpretation.
Awesome. I would love for folks as well. We have some data here from the survey that we run on an annual basis. But what have folks experienced, whether as the independent contractor or the employee or as the actual group practice owner? What have you all experienced and what do you feel is common? And I also don't want to use the word fair because everybody approaches business differently. And one of the things that I want to get get beyond rather is chastising other folks for how they approach their work as well, because we should be supporting each other in building our group practices. But I'd love to see what everybody else has been experiencing historically. Yeah, 60/40, I've heard that a lot. Um, According to the financial state of private practice report, and Mike, I think we had 2,500 or 3,000 folks fill it out. Is that right?
It was over 2,000.
Yeah, over 2,000. So 70% of group practice owners, of course, use a fee split. The most common is going to be 60/40, followed by 70/30. I also have helped set up group practices for folks where they're like, we're doing so much and taking on so much of the cost that we're going to do 55/45 or 50/50. And so whatever folks decide to do, some of the factors that they take into consideration is the amount of cost that we're covering, the amount of risk that we're taking on, right? So a full-time clinician that's been a clinician for 10 years, that's trained in that specific modality that your practice is oriented around is probably different than a therapist intern that hasn't really done clinical work before. And so how you think about the fee split may be different for that full-time person that's been doing it for a long time versus that therapist intern. And there is no judgment for how somebody approaches this in their work.
I'll say that what I've heard from group practice owners is that folks who are working for the group don't always understand the costs associated with running the group practice, right? So it can seem like, oh, the group practice owner is so greedy, they're taking 40% of my money that I'm bringing into the business, when in reality, there's actually a lot of costs that go into operating the business that that money goes towards covering. So, I think it can be helpful to explain, where that 40% is going. It's not just going into their pocket.
That's an incredibly important point. So I'm glad that you said that. How to stay compliant. Consult a legal professional after following the other steps that I had recommended. Register as an employer, get an EIN. You can do it as a sole proprietor and get an EIN, but you want to separate the business and the personal here. And so strong recommendation to separate your business assets from your personal assets, whether it's an LLC or a PLLC if you're in California, professional corp. There are benefits to setting up, this new entity as an S corp as well, which we have lots of other content on at a certain level of income. Collect W-4s from employees and W-9s from contractors because you're going to have to pay those, or you're going to have to send the 1099s at the end of the year. The W-9s help provide that information in order to do that. W-4s are great. You're probably using payroll software, so they'll probably, file all of the requisite payroll forms for you and get you the W-2s and all of that good stuff at the end of the year. Most states for employees require workers' compensation. And you certainly have to report these new hires to the state. Don't try to be sneaky. That will always come back and bite you.
Great. We're coming to the end. We will save, it looks like we have about 10 minutes here, so we're happy to field some questions. Wanted to throw this back up here. If you're interested in getting help with, setting up payroll for your business, thinking about, managing your finances on an ongoing basis, you are encouraged to schedule a free consultation with our team. There's no commitment for doing so. If you just scan this QR code, you can sign up for a call. Would love to chat with you and, see if we can help you as you expand your business. Great. Andrews has been really helpful. Want to take some questions here from the audience. I'm curious, just in your experience, Andrew, when it comes to group practice owners who hire interns and pre-licensed folks versus, group practices who hire therapists who are licensed, have you seen kind of a compensation structure that is tiered, where say, it's like the fee split maybe is less so for a fully licensed therapist or maybe a supervisor versus someone who's in supervision?
Oh yeah, it's yeah, totally different. I would say like often for the pre-licensed professionals, it falls at like the 50 to 60/40 mark. You're just taking on so much risk. These folks are still learning, they're still growing in their practice. And I think in taking on that risk and taking on the cost and taking on the overhead of supervision, I've also seen as a specific example to where this individual was a contractor. It was a group practice. They were a contractor and they were responsible for paying for it was a group practice with two owners and they were responsible for paying for all the supervision individually. But that individual was able to scale up their caseload however big they wanted. Um, I think it actually ended up being pretty similar from a cost standpoint over time in the way that they structured it as well. So there's different ways that you can cut the cake on that one, but it's much harder to justify, um, despite the work that you're doing to drive acquisition. I think specifically in a telehealth first world, to justify a heavy fee split for clinicians that are independent and have been operating independently for 5, 10 plus years. Certainly because the shared services structure just looks totally different.
Definitely. And I think when it comes to W-2 versus 1099, something I've heard as well is from a hiring perspective, therapists who are, this isn't everyone, but, a lot of therapists are looking for more job security with a group practice. So they may be looking for a W-2 role that has benefits because they have been self-employed and it's expensive to get your own insurance. And so from a like hiring perspective, it can be more valuable or appealing to have a W-2 role versus an independent contractor role. I'm curious, and if you have any other thoughts or advice on how to hire, because I know that that's a challenge for a lot of, group practice owners. Are there strategies or tactics that you've seen therapists use that, as it relates to like hiring and recruiting therapists?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, hiring in general is super hard and it takes a really long time. And you want to make sure that you get the right person. And you want to make sure that you get the right person versus a person at the right time, if that makes sense. There's nothing more challenging than hiring the wrong person, and that's a lot to undo. So truly hire slow and hire quickly if it's not a good fit. Uh, but what I've seen a lot of clinicians do, it's similar to how they build their referral networks, right? Like a lot of people build relationships with universities and they'll do adjunct work, right? And so there's one group practice in San Francisco that I think about, and she's basically built her entire pipeline of pre-licensed professionals uh, coming from UCSF. And so she does a lot of teaching work there, and she does a specific elective course around operating in private practice and setting up a practice, which isn't often common in a master's program, which is cool. And lots of those folks come and work with her for 2 to 3 years, and then she sets them up, helps them get licensed, helps them build a practice, coaches them on how to build a practice, and gets out into the world. Um, Another place is going to as many events as you possibly can and connecting in your community. Certainly Facebook groups. Um, I feel less excited about just posting a job on Indeed or on LinkedIn. I think that's less likely to get pulled down. But you can also just dig into those Facebook groups and communities if you don't want to get out and get into the community and go to events and just build relationships with other folks and just let them know what you're up to and what your goals are. And oftentimes they'll have thoughts and make introductions. So just start building that network and start putting out into the world what your goal is.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. The advice that Elizabeth Earnshaw shared on the podcast was one, just like be good to people because then people will want to work for you.
Yeah.
Like you'll just have a good reputation in the community. And the way that she's hired the 30 therapists in her group practice has been entirely through word of mouth. So it's therapists that work for her practice, people that they used to work with, a friend that, is looking for a job. So it's a lot of people come that way. So it's like from referrals from therapists who already work in her practice.
The other thing that I would say as well is like qualitative and a more of a touchy feely thing, but well, one, I guess more tactically modality. So in the same thing that Mike always talks about in his therapy marketer newsletter is be as niche as you possibly can, and you're going to attract people that are in the same niche and get connected in those communities naturally. And I think those types of natural connections lead to an extension that could be hiring. But also lead with values. Figure out what your values are, right? And what are the values of your practice, and how is your practice going to be different than other practices, right? And what matters most to you, and that's going to be what resonates most with employees. Employees get bought into a mission and who you are as a leader and who you are as an individual. And so when you think about going out and hiring folks, that's a very, very important piece of it.
Any thoughts on retaining therapists? So, how do you get good people to stay in your group practice and not leave?
I think at the end of the day, yeah, there's several folks on this call that are group practice owners that probably have better context on that, but um, professional development, covering continuing education, providing business-like professional development opportunities. I think uh, one of the things that I've seen for folks that have built really successful practices like this, this individual that works at UCSF and runs this big practice in San Francisco, uh, she explicitly states at the beginning, like, I want to help you become an individual private practice owner over time. And I want you to feel confident in that. And I want you to like build up this caseload, but I'm here to support you as long as possible. And so, coaching both on the clinical side and helping set them up for success and teaching them everything that you've learned is going to be incredibly important from a clinical standpoint. But my wife, as an example, went and worked at a group practice because she's like, I want to see what that looks like to set up a group practice and how that feels and what the challenges are. And so those are things that a lot of folks want to learn. And so both, professional development from a business standpoint, but also from a clinical standpoint, pay is also going to be something that just keeps somebody around. Pay and benefits. Benefits are a big one.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it comes down to understanding your employees, right, and what their motivations are. And, some people just want to show up and see clients and go home at night, and that's great. And some people want to feel like they're growing and developing in their careers. And so having opportunities for professional development or even positions within the group, maybe they could become the clinical director of that practice. Elizabeth Earnshaw talked about how she has multiple locations and she's promoted therapists who are in her practice to clinical directors for each location. So they're basically running the practice almost independently, and then she oversees kind of her team of clinical directors. So there's an opportunity for them to grow and take on leadership within the group.
Yeah, I loved Lorraine's comment in here of um, once she's helped them get fully licensed, a lot of them don't want to leave, and there's the coaching element that she enjoys so much, and that's fun. And the reality is, not everybody wants to spend the time doing that. It's really, really freaking hard work, and so people will be drawn to that, and people want to be W-2 employees in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and if they learn how to be a private practice owner at your group and go and start their own practice, I think that's a great thing too. And now you have another practice that you can refer to and they can refer to you. And I think that's, rising tide lifts all boats or whatever the saying is, right?
A great cliche to end on,
Yeah.
Mike.
Awesome. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you everyone for spending this hour with us. Really appreciate your time and attention. Hope this was valuable for you. We'll share out the recording. We'll share out the link to the slides, and we'll send that link as well in a follow-up email if you're interested in scheduling a consultation with our team. Absolutely no pressure there. With that, have a great Friday and enjoy your weekend.
Thanks so much, everyone.